started, so 2 minutes.
I wouldn't mind betting I was at MIT before you, Anna.
Yeah, hard to say, but I think so. Maybe just a few years.
What year did you graduate, Graham, if you are willing to share?
Yeah, I finished my PhD in 76.
Susan, that would
Long
be
time
similar
ago.
to when you were in the joint program.
It is. It's I was just finishing my PhD in 76 in the joint program with Woods Hole Oceanographic.
Well, how about that?
Yeah. Which department were you in?
Civil engineering,
Okay. Yeah.
the Ralph Parsons lab of water resources.
All right. Okay.
Did you know Don Harleman at all, who was head of the lab?
No, I didn't know him. No. I was in the green building.
Okay.
Hi, Zachary, welcome. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Where are you calling from, Zachary?
I'm in Sydney.
Great.
Unfortunately, I can only join for the first half hour, but interested to hear more about this topic.
That's fine. We're recording it, so we'll make that available afterwards so that people who aren't able to attend can watch later.
Great.
All right, well, it's 1 minute past, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. We did have about 20 people register, so hopefully some more people will be joining in the next couple of minutes. With Zoom calls and Teams calls, always seems that they run a few minutes over, so I do hope we have a few more people joining. Before I introduce Susan, some housekeeping. So if everybody can make sure that they're on mute during the call, that would be great. And what we'll do is we'll let Susan give her talk. It will take about 45 minutes. If you have any questions, either remember them and ask them at the end, or if you are worried you might forget the question, feel free to type it into the chat and we'll be sure to go to the chat after the call. The other bit of housekeeping I wanted to say is that we're in the process of trying to rejuvenate the MIT Club of Australia. It's been a little bit dormant the past few years, and we will try and do in-person events, but it is a challenge because Australia is really big. So it's kind of like saying we're going to have an MIT Club of the United States of America and trying to organize in-person events. It's really difficult to do things in all the cities all the time. But we will be trying to do events in all the major cities when we can. But we thought it would also be nice to maybe every month or two have a virtual event like this, where we do a talk as a way that we can connect. And if anybody wants to, I've got some time after this. If anybody wants to stay and have a bit of a chat or networking once Susan's talk is finished, we can maybe incorporate that a bit as well into these monthly online events. So stay tuned. There may be a talk sooner than this, but the next talk that I've confirmed will be a really exciting one. We're going to have Lindy Elkins-Tanton, who is an MIT alum. She is a planetary scientist, and she's the principal investigator for the Psyche mission, which, if you don't know, is a mission where NASA is going to go and land on an asteroid very soon. So her talk is going to be in December, hopefully after the mission is successful. So that should be a really exciting talk. So there'll be some advertisements for that in the coming months. I believe that's all of the housekeeping. So what I'd like to do is introduce Dr. Susan Humphris from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Susan is a marine geochemist, and she is a graduate of the MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution Joint Program in Chemical Oceanography. She has worked as a marine scientist for many years, and among her many accomplishments, one thing that she can say she's done in her career is she's been down to the bottom of the ocean in the submersible Alvin more than 30 times during the course of her career. So I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that, and you might have some questions about that as well. The other thing that I'd like to say about Susan is that Susan was my PhD supervisor when I went through the MIT HUI joint program. I graduated in 2012. So Susan is very dear to me, and I really appreciate all of the support that she gave me during my studies and since then. So it was an obvious thing for me to call up Susan and have her give this first talk in this series that we're rejuvenating. So thank you very much, Susan, for your time and agreeing to give the talk.
My pleasure.
So Susan, I'll hand over to you. If you could share your slides, that would be great. And again,
Okay.
just the questions in the chat if you want.
All right, let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, can you see that?
It looks great, Susan.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak with all of you. I guess I should wish you a good Friday morning because it's Thursday night where I am. So, and I think for most of you, it's Friday morning. But I appreciate it, and I appreciate the kind words from Evelyn about, and I have to say, I enjoyed supervising Evelyn when she went through the joint program. What I'd like to do this evening, my time, is talk to you a little bit about some of the work that I've been involved in over the course of my career that has been focused on probably one of the biggest discoveries in oceanography in the late 20th century. And that is the existence of hot springs on the deep ocean floor. And as you can imagine, because they're so remote, we have different ways and different technologies that we use to study them. So what I'd like to try to do is I'd like to take you on some trips to the bottom of the ocean to take a look at what these hot springs look like. And in doing so, I'm going to use 3 different types of technology that we use for exploring on the seafloor. But first, let me set the stage a little bit. We're going to focus in this talk on the mid-ocean ridge system, which is the longest chain of volcanoes that we have on our planet. It stretches down through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, round into the southern Indian Ocean, and then it heads up the eastern side of the Pacific, under the US continent, and then pops out again off the coast of Oregon and Washington. And this, as I said, is the longest chain of volcanoes, and it marks the boundary of 2 tectonic plates that, if you look at this convection, these convection cells, you can see between them, as the plates are moving apart, molten rock erupts on the sea floor and forms new oceanic crust. And it's along those ridges where we have all this heat associated with the volcanic activity that we find many, not all, but many of the hot springs on the sea floor. So what does lava look like when it erupts on the sea floor? Well, this is some footage, and I have to confess, this isn't from a mid-ocean ridge. It's actually from a seamount. We've actually never seen an eruption on a mid-ocean ridge. And what you can see is that the lava, as it is erupting, the surface of it tends to quench. And you can see it here. The surface of it tends to quench very rapidly, and the lava inside continues to flow out, and it forms this almost toothpaste tube-like terrain. And because of this, this lava is very broken up. It's still quite warm, and you can see that it forms this very jumbled lava that makes up the top layer of our oceanic crust. Now you can see that on individual pillows, like the one in the top middle there, you've got lots of very small cracks and fissures in it. And you can see that the rock is of a very jumbled nature. It's not all one big slab of rock like you would see, for example, granite. And because of that, it means it's very permeable. You also have big cracks on the seafloor along the mid-ocean ridge because the plates are spreading apart, and as they do, you create tension and stresses, and the rocks crack apart and form these fissures. And the reason that I'm telling you all of this is because this is a fundamental way in which seawater gets down into the young, hot crust. And as it does, that heat can set up convection cells that create the deep sea hot springs. So what we're really looking at is something like this diagram here. You basically have permeable ocean crust, which seawater can percolate down into. If you're near a heat source like a magma chamber under a volcano, or an intrusion of hot rock, that water will get heated up. And once it's heated up, it becomes buoyant and it comes upwells back to the surface of the bottom of the ocean and is erupted on the sea floor in what we call hydrothermal vents. And those vents then create these plumes of fluid that then rise up in the water column to a neutral density level, and then they spread out laterally. So hydrothermal vents were discovered in 1977, and since then there have been a number of studies that have looked at them, and as of now there's about 500 known sites around the world. And this is a map that boldly declares that this is the global distribution of hydrothermal vents. It probably isn't the global distribution of hydrothermal vents. It's more a map of how easy it is to go and explore the bottom of the ocean in these various parts of the world. For example, if you look in the Eastern Pacific, the mid-ocean ridge is very close to the continent, and so it appears that hydrothermal vents are numerous. If you go to the North Atlantic, it's about 5 days drive from Woods Hole to get out there, so there's quite a few there. Once you get into the South Atlantic and round into the Indian Ocean, the observations become fewer and fewer. So the fact of the matter is that we actually don't know what the distribution of vents is currently in the ocean. And I'll explain why that's important at the end. So how do we go and study these vents? Well, one way that we use is with vehicles like this. This is the human-occupied vehicle Alvin that is transported out to the middle of the ocean on board a research vessel, the research vessel Atlantis. And I'm going to just show you how, I'm going to call this vehicle simple, but how many or how few parts there are actually to it. The people, and normally the Alvin takes a pilot and 2 scientists, are inside a 6-foot diameter sphere. So it's very, very cramped. And that sphere is made of 3-inch thick titanium. And it's a sphere made of this very resilient metal in order to withstand the pressures that you will encounter as you go down in the ocean. On the front of the Alvin, well, on the actual sphere, there's a series of portholes that are quite small, about 6 inches in diameter, that the pilot and the scientist can use for observations. On the front of the Alvin, you can see 2 mechanical arms that are manipulated by the pilot, and a basket to put samples in, take instruments down, etc. And of course, there's a bank of lights right above that because it's dark at the bottom of the ocean. It has a series of propellers or thrusters, as we call them, that allow it to spin on its own axis and move the vehicle around. It is driven by batteries. In this case, lead acid batteries, just like most cars, except EVs. The other feature that's important to know about is the 2 spheres that are on the left side of the vehicle. They're also on the other side as well, near the back. These are what are called variable ballast spheres. And they're important because when I go down in the Alvin, I collect rocks. And so I put rocks in the basket on the front. And obviously the neutral buoyancy that you've achieved with Alvin at the bottom of the ocean is lost because I've just added a whole load of weight to it. Those spheres are filled with seawater, and as I add weight to the basket at the front, seawater can be pumped out of those spheres to try to maintain neutral buoyancy. So let's go down in Alvin and see what we see. So here Alvin is being got out of its garage. It comes out on a rail out onto the after deck of the ship. You can see one of the porthole, you see two of the portholes as the vehicle comes out. The people climb down in through the sail, which is that red or reddish orange structure on the top, climb down a ladder and get into it. And then the vehicle is let go from the ship. This is an untethered vehicle. And the divers are there just to make sure, swim down before it dives and make sure everything is secure. And then off you go to the bottom of the ocean. Typically takes about 1.5 to 2 hours to get down and 1.5 to 2 hours to get back up. So it's rather a long commute to work. So what does a hydrothermal vent or a submarine hot spring look like? Well, this is what they look like. And you can imagine that when the first people saw these, which was the black smokers were found in 1979, everyone thought they looked like chimneys spewing out black smoke, and so they're known as black smoker chimneys. That's actually a very bad name for them, because that black smoke that you see is actually a superheated fluid derived originally from seawater that has temperatures up to 350 to 400 degrees centigrade, which is about 750 or more degrees Fahrenheit. The black color is due to the precipitation of metal sulfides, things like iron and copper and zinc sulfide that make up the structure that we now call a chimney. And these are the structures that actually create mineral deposits on the sea floor. Now, just to show you how difficult working down at this depths and in these environments are, this is actually some footage of trying to take a sample of fluid from a black smoker chimney. You can see the idea is to stick that snorkel as far down as you can and then pump that fluid into the titanium containers. And you can imagine how difficult this is because you're trying to sample a fluid that is flowing into another fluid. And so it's very, very difficult. And there is actually a temperature probe on the end of that snorkel in order for you to try to establish when to take the sample when the temperature reading is the maximum temperature that you can get. And that's the best that you can do. So this is what a chimney looks like, and this is the sort of thing that that I'm interested in. I study the chemical reactions that end up producing these chimneys. And you can see here that the chimney is made up of layers of different colored sulfide minerals. This chimney opening here is about, let me think, about 9 inches in diameter. And you can see the interior layer is it's a very bright gold color. It doesn't show so well in this picture. And that is the highest temperature sulfide that is precipitated, which is chalcopyrite, which is a copper iron sulfide. And you can imagine fluid in the middle of this discharging through that orifice at temperatures of 350 or 400 degrees centigrade, whereas on the outer edge side of the wall, the wall is only about maybe 2.5 to 3 centimeters, maybe 4 centimeters thick, you have bottom seawater, essentially at 0 degrees centigrade. So you have a very, very sharp temperature contrast between the interior and exterior of this chimney. Now, I'm going to take you first of all to the Eastern Pacific, which is where some of the first vents were discovered. And I'm going to point out some features of them because ultimately I'm going to compare this to some other parts of the world. So these are chimneys. They're all aligned in a row here. Those chimneys are about the height, about 6 feet or 2 meters tall. So they're not very big. You can see here that the fluid coming out turns black as it spews out because of the precipitation of those minerals. And associated with these sites these absolutely amazing oases of life that are completely unlike many things that have been seen before. These are actually tube worms, and they grow up to about 10 feet long. So you know that there's a lot of food. There's crabs that obviously they're scavengers that eat around these structures. The crabs have no eyes. There's not much point in having eyes at the bottom of the ocean because it's dark. And the interesting thing about these organisms is that if you take the tube worm and put it under a scanning electron microscope, which is shown here, you can see that the interior is actually made up or is filled with microorganisms and other bacteria. The worm itself doesn't have a mouth and it doesn't have a gut. What it has is this sac-like structure that in which it essentially farms or acts as a residence for the bacteria and microorganisms. And this is a symbiotic relationship between the worm, who supplies those organisms with carbon dioxide, oxygen to breathe, and creates chemical energy, as I'll explain in a minute, and the worm, who then is able to live off of those bacteria and microorganisms. So it's a very unusual, it's not, it's been seen elsewhere, but it was never expected to be seen at the bottom of the ocean. This is another animal that's found down there. These are clams, as you can see, and also a few mussels. And these clams are very large. These clams are about 1 foot across. And again, if you look inside there, or if you cut them open and put them under a microscope, well, first of all, if you cut them open, they look really awful and they smell awful. They smell of hydrogen sulfide. They are this dark red color because they contain hemoglobin, just as we do, because they need to move oxygen to the bacteria that live inside them. And this is the soft parts of the clam, which also relies on bacteria and microorganisms. So we have to ask the question, what is going on here? How do we start out with seawater that is circulating down into the crust and end up with this fluid that, first of all, contains a lot of metals, and secondly, can be a home to an oasis of exotic organisms? So what we have is cold seawater going down and coming back up and creating these mineral deposits. What happens on the path of this seawater is that as it heats up, it chemically reacts with the volcanic rock that it's traveling through. And the fluid composition gets changed because of the chemical reactions with the rock. And this is just a comparison. I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but basically you start out with seawater, which is cold, and you end up with a very hot fluid. In terms of acidity, seawater is slightly alkaline, but you end up with an acidic fluid. All the oxygen, which is quite abundant in seawater, gets used up, and you produce hydrogen sulfide, which is going to become very important in a minute. And then if you look at the bottom set of numbers, it's a comparison of some metals, the concentrations in seawater compared to the hydrothermal fluid. And you can see in this process, the hydrothermal fluid becomes enriched by orders of magnitude in those metals. So what is happening is that we have a chemical weathering process going on, whereby when the seawater first enters and it's rich in oxygen and it's cold, it reacts and oxidizes some of the minerals in those rocks. And then as it travels through, those reactions, as the water heats up, start to change, different minerals are formed, and you create an acidic fluid. And so by the time the fluid gets hot and at depth and is acidic, it then, and is also reducing, it then enables metals to be leached from the rock, and they're widely dispersed in the rock, and leached and concentrated in that upflowing fluid. So the fluid upwells, discharges, meets the oxygenated seawater, and the minerals, metal sulfides, precipitate out at the sea floor. So if we look in the Pacific, these are some of the animals that we see. And so why are these hot springs home to these types of organisms? Well, we have photosynthesis, as you know, that accounts for about 98% of the synthesis of green plants on Earth. And that process obviously is not going to work at the bottom of the ocean because there's no sun. What we have at the bottom of the ocean is actually a chemosynthetic process whereby bacteria and other microorganisms are able to use the chemicals that are in that hydrothermal fluid, particularly hydrogen sulfide, methane, and carbon dioxide. Not so much carbon dioxide in this case, excuse me. Methane and hydrogen sulfide. They are able to use those chemicals as a source of energy to then synthesize organic matter. And so instead of green plants, we have bacteria, and instead of the sun, we have chemicals from the earth. And this process has been known for a long time. It occurs in muds, in salt marshes, and places like that, but it had never been known to exist at the bottom of the ocean. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is I'd like to jump to the Atlantic Ocean, to a place that I have been studying for many, many years. It's my favorite hydrothermal vent, I have to say. And I'm going to take you down deeper now by another 1,000 meters. So we're going to go down to about 3,600 meters in the ocean. And we're going to use a different technology to do it. This is a vehicle called Jason. It's a remotely operated vehicle, which means that there are no people in it. It is attached to the ship by a fiber optic cable, which means that you can send power down to it, so you're not limited by batteries, and you can transmit imagery back up to the surface in real time. It is, so in many ways, it's a lot safer than using or sending people to the bottom of the ocean. This is just a little cartoon as to how it works. The way it is operated is there is a control van on the ship in which a pilot, a navigator, and an engineer all operate the vehicle, and then the scientists stand around at the back watching what's going on. This is, in many ways, as I said, this is a safer technique. It does mean that the scientists are viewing things on a screen rather in 3 dimensions. And so it is, in my opinion, I think there's a use for it, but I think there are times when it's useful to have eyes at the bottom of the ocean. And the other thing that happens is that you can imagine that in a submersible with 2 scientists, you can make a decision on which rock to pick up. But if you've got an entire scientific shipboard party of 12 or 15 scientists watching what's going on, it takes forever to come to an agreement as to what to pick up. Okay, so this mineral deposit we're going to now is called the Tag Active Mound. It doesn't matter why it's called Tag. This is a very large mineral deposit. It's almost 4 million metric tons of sulfides. And it's estimated there's about 30 to 60,000 tons of copper in the deposit. It is the largest mineral deposit that's been found to date at the bottom of the ocean. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very deep. It's at about 3,600 meters. Now, when you dive on it, you start to see some very different sorts of things from what I had been showing you. These are anemones. And the outer parts of that I did want to point out, this comparison with the Colosseum in Rome is actually to scale. And so the mineral deposit is almost the size of the Colosseum in Rome. So on the outskirts of the deposit, you see these are anemones that are waving their tentacles in the breeze and are actually trapping microorganisms that are being washed out of the mound. Up on one side of it, there's an area of small chimneys that are emitting white smoke. And this reminded us of the minarets that you see in pictures of Moscow. And so we ended up calling it, well, I forgot what we called it now. I'll remember. The Kremlin area, we called it. The chimneys on the top of this deposit are very, very big, unlike the Pacific chimneys. They're at least 15 meters tall. We've never seen the top of them because the black smoke of fluid is so dense we can't get in. And they're about 3 meters in diameter. And as you can see, we don't see any worms, we don't see any clams. Instead, we see these shrimp. This is the top, well, as near as we can get to one of these black smokers. And that fluid coming out, we first found this site in 1975. And every time we've been back since, it's been belching out black smoke like that at a temperature of 368 degrees centigrade. And the surfaces are covered in these shrimp. And if you look at these shrimp, you can see they've got this arrow-shaped patch on the backs of their carapaces. And they don't have eyes as we know eyes. This arrow-shaped patch appears to be seeing infrared radiation, which makes sense because they need to stay around the heat because that's where their food is. And they're swarming against the sides of the chimneys because they're actually digging in the chimney wall and getting out, ingesting the bacteria that live in the chimney wall. Okay, so I've taken you to the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. And one of the earliest observations out of going to these two different oceans was that the biological communities at them are different. And so the question is, how can they be different? And where would you go in the world if you wanted to see how and possibly how and where larvae from these communities get transported? And if you look at the deep water circulation of the ocean circulates from the Atlantic into the ocean and into the Pacific. And so we said, okay, what we have to do is go to the Indian Ocean, and if larvae are being transported, the Indian Ocean vents should look like mid-Atlantic ridge vents. So we went to the Indian Ocean and we were able to find, which is not always easy, some hydrothermal vents. And when we looked at those vents, it turned out we saw shrimp and anemones, and we said, aha, that makes a lot of sense. However, when we looked more closely at the communities of organisms, we saw a hairy snail and these pink long-stalked barnacles. And those are communities that are in Western Pacific vents. And so even though the Atlantic community animals were more abundant, there were just as many types of animals from the Western Pacific. So that basically told us that we had a little bit more work to do. So as scientists, and particularly biologists, have gone around the world, they have found that the vents create different biogeographic provinces. In the equatorial Pacific, tube worms are the most common type of organism. In the Northeast Pacific, it's another worm called an alvinellid that is named after the submersible Alvin. In the Western Pacific, hairy snails are the most common sort of animal. In the North Atlantic, mussels are most common. And then at the site I just showed you, TAG, as you go a little bit further south, shrimp are the most common animals. More recently, people have started to fill in some of the other areas. Oh, I forgot the Indian Ocean. In the Indian Ocean, snails and shrimp, so a mixed community. And as biologists have studied other areas, they have now been to the Caribbean, and the Caribbean is characterized by shrimp at the hydrothermal vents. And in the Southern Ocean, in that jigsaw piece puzzle between the tip of South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, we see these, which are called Yeti crabs. And they have these furry legs and appendages on which a lot of bacteria actually live. And then the Yeti crab eats those bacteria. So the place that you'd really like to go, and where we will go next, is the Arctic Ocean. And the reason you'd like to go to the Arctic is there is a mid-ocean ridge in the Arctic called the Gackel Ridge. And the reason that this is interesting is because the Arctic Ocean is very much surrounded by land and by shallow sills that between those continents. And so the Gackel Ridge is at a depth of over 4,000 meters, and those sills between the northern oceans and the Arctic Ocean are usually at about 800 meters or 1,000. So the Arctic has been isolated for a long period of time. So if you're going to find anything different, you would go to the Arctic. And so in 2007, we had an expedition up there, now using a third type of technology, which are autonomous underwater vehicles. And these are vehicles that you program to go into a task and then come back up. And we had two vehicles, and I'm going to use an analogy to a helicopter. The first vehicle is like a helicopter doing a survey, driving back and forth and back and forth. And attached to that autonomous underwater vehicle was our chemical and physical sensors that can sense those hydrothermal plumes that rise up above the vents. So this vehicle goes out first, drives around, and looks for signals of vents. The second vehicle is similar to a helicopter in hover mode. Its strength is that it can hover in place, and it has lights and cameras. And so it is used after the search vehicle and goes down for a close-up look. Well, this is just an example of what OceanViz is like sometimes. We had the first difficulties we had, of course, is that the Arctic is covered in ice. And so we were on an icebreaker, but you have to make sure that the vehicle is going to come up in a patch of water that you have created. And we actually were pretty good at this, and it worked quite a number of times. However, the other problem is that sometimes it didn't come up where it was directed to come up, and it came up in the middle of a big ice flow. And here what you can see is a rope that is now attached to that yellow autonomous vehicle. And the way we found it, it was in the middle of an ice sheet that was about 2 miles across, was that the engineers had been very clever and put an avalanche beacon on the vehicle. And so the helicopter could fly over the ice sheet, and the red stake that you see that's just to the left of the helicopter there was put down when, with the avalanche beacon, we were able to detect where the vehicle had come up. And then we were able to icebreak our way in send the helicopter out and recover the vehicle. Well, I have to tell you that we did not find high temperature vents up there, although they do exist, as we know as of about 3 years ago. However, what we did find was something quite fascinating. We found on the young volcanic rock, which is this dark gray material that you see here, you can see this yellow fluff. And we called it yellow fluff because we didn't know what it was. And it turns out to be a soup of all sorts of different microorganisms, many of which had never been detected before. So there's clearly fluids coming out of this volcanic rock that these bacteria are able to live on. Okay, so why have I just spent the last 45 minutes talking about this, and why do we care about these vents? Well, there's a number of reasons. Some are more academic than others. The first one is what impact this has on removing heat from our Earth. We know that our Earth is losing heat from radioactive decay in the interior of the Earth. Most of that heat is conducted from the Earth's interior out to the Earth's surface. However, we now know that we have this other process where seawater is moving heat from Earth's interior by convection up to the seafloor. And we think it might account for about 1/3 of the heat lost from Earth's interior is lost by convection rather than conduction. The second reason is that these reactions that I've talked about that convert seawater into hydrothermal fluid, if they go on for a long period of time, which they will do, because all you need to have a hydrothermal vent is a heat source, a fluid, and permeable material, it's going to affect the chemistry of seawater. And the impact of this process is variable on different elements. And I will give you one example of where it is probably extremely important. And that is the element magnesium. Magnesium is a very common cation in seawater. And when geochemists like me look at an element, we like to do these budgets where we try to estimate how from all the sources of magnesium coming into the ocean, do they balance all the ways that we know that magnesium is removed from the ocean? And for many, many years, up until the mid-70s, there was a magnesium problem. That is, it appeared that twice as much magnesium was being put down through rivers into the ocean than we could account for that was being removed. And yet we know that over long geologic time periods, the relative proportions of elements in the ocean have stayed constant. Well, it turns out that these chemical reactions that go on between seawater and rocks remove almost all the magnesium from the seawater. So this is a very important sink for magnesium. The formation of ore deposits. I showed you a 4 million metric ton deposit on the seafloor. This is a much bigger deposit, although it's been mined out here. This is on the island of Cyprus. And Cyprus has, as you probably know, a long history of being mined for copper. And this particular deposit is about 100 million years old. And so ore geologists would look at this and try to determine how ore deposits form at the bottom of the ocean. I should add that these mineral deposits in Cyprus are actually in a chunk of oceanic crust that has been thrust up onto the land. So you can go and walk on seafloor on land in Cyprus. Now we can go down to the bottom of the ocean and actually watch mineral deposits in the process of formation. And we're learning a lot about how the mineral deposit actually forms and then gets preserved in somewhat of a different form as you create these older deposits. Existence of new deep sea biological communities. There have now been over 900 new species of animals that have been identified and described from seafloor hydrothermal vents. And it's created a whole new field of hydrothermal vent biology that we didn't know existed before. And finally, people always like to know if there are any industrial or biotechnological applications for these microorganisms. And I'm sure you've heard of the Human Genome Project. It turns out that in the early days of the Human Genome Project, enzymes from heat-loving bacteria from Yellowstone National Park were used to catalyze PCR reactions to make the multiple copies of the DNA. Later in that project, they started using enzymes from bacteria from hydrothermal vents because they were able to culture them in the lab. And since then, enzymes from hydrothermal vent bacteria have been used in catalyzing the PCR reaction for a number of different applications. So you can see that this has been a huge discovery. It has been the discovery that has occupied me for my career because I started working on these working on the altered rocks in 1976 before the vents were even discovered. And there's still a lot to learn. We still don't really know their distribution, so we really can't yet estimate with any sort of accuracy how important they are to all of these aspects of the chemistry of seawater, the microbiology, and the formation of mineral deposits. So I'll stop there and thank you and ask for any questions.
Thank you very much, Susan. That was a fascinating talk. Before we get into the questions, I'll just say this is one reason why I wanted to go to Woods Hole to study marine geology, is that it's incredible how recently we've learned so much about the seafloor and how much there is still to learn. It's amazing when you say only 3 years ago we knew about the hydrothermal vents and the Gackle Ridge. It's quite extraordinary. So I'll stop there. Does anyone want to ask Susan any questions? I don't see any hands, but just go ahead and speak if you have a question.
I have a question. I actually got the chance to visit Woods Hole and do a tour of the Institute, which was a really cool experience. And I remember the tour guide mentioning that sometimes when the scientists are actually inside Alvin, that they end up spending more time looking at the monitors than actually looking at the viewports. Do you think that might be true, or do you think it's sort of split evenly, or what is that experience like going, down so deep and getting to actually see with your own eyes the sea life?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've heard some scientists say that too. I personally think that going down and looking through the porthole and being able to see things in 3D, and also the relations of, say, an organism to the rock, is really important. And I think that the scientists that tend to go down and look at the monitors are people who are taking instruments down there. Many of us that go down there, one of our main ways that we can do our science is by describing what we see. And so I tend to look out the porthole. I will say that in the original Alvin, there were only 3 portholes, and they were looking at 90 degrees to each other. And the reason for that was that the original Alvin was built for observational purposes, and it was felt that if you had 3 people and they all looked in different directions, you'd all see, even though you'd see different parts of the seafloor, the combined area of seafloor that you saw was going to be the maximized. As we got used to using Alvin and doing more and more experiments and trying to take samples, it became very awkward to not be able to see what the pilot could see. So in the new version of the Alvin, we actually have 5 portholes, 3 of which have overlapping fields of view. So I think there's a lot of value to having the eye-brain connection right there, looking at what you're seeing, rather than looking at a monitor, which, you know, you just don't get the 3 dimensions at all.
That's great, Susan. Does anyone else have a question for Susan?
Hi, Susan. I don't know anything about the ocean, so this has been really interesting. Thank you for that. Can you tell us a little bit more about Alvin, how safe it is, how deep it can go? You know, there was a lot of news in recent times about, was it Titan, the private?
Yes. There was. Yeah, so Alvin is, let me first say that Alvin is a US owned and Navy certified vehicle. So it goes through all the required inspections that are required by the Navy. Alvin can go to 6,500 meters, which is 20,000 feet. And it is made of titanium, and it is made of titanium because that is the material that is able to withstand the pressures the best. It is a sphere because a sphere will have an even distribution of stress on its surfaces. The Titan, which was, you know, a complete tragedy, I'm afraid, had a number of designs that would be questionable, and they had not gone through any of the certifications or inspections that are recommended. And so it was not a certified vehicle. A couple of things, it was a cylinder, first of all, which isn't a good shape if you're going to try to go deep. It had titanium end caps attached to a carbon fiber body, which meant you had 2 dissimilar materials that had to be joined. And the other thing was it had a very, very big porthole in the end of the sub. And those portholes are made of plexiglass, essentially. And they're the weakest part of the sub. And in the Alvin, we guard them against any sort of scratches. We're really particular. If you wear glasses and go down in Alvin, you actually have to put tape over the nose piece and the rims to make sure that you don't scratch that plexiglass, because once it's scratched, the scratch will propagate. So Alvin has been around since 1963, and it's the only sub in the US that can go to 6,500 meters.
That's great, Susan. Maybe to add to that question, when I was a graduate student, I remember you were working many long hours because you were overseeing the refurbishment, the overhaul of Alvin. Do you want to tell a little bit about that? Because there was quite a significant change in its capability.
Yeah, so back in 2009, Alvin had been around, as I said, since '63, and there was a desire by the community, scientific community, to want to be able to go deeper. At the time, it could only go to 4,500 meters. And so it was felt it was time for a major overhaul. And I was the principal investigator to oversee that overhaul. I'm not an engineer. I was there from the science perspective, but I had some great engineers working on the project. So we had a new titanium sphere was forged and built, and then the engineers at Woods Hole actually did the fit out and the build of the rest of the vehicle. And so it ended up going, it is now a 6,500 meter vehicle.
Thanks, Susan. Do we have any other questions? Just speak up if you've got a question for Susan.
I have another question. I'm actually currently a master's student, and I'm doing my thesis research in conjunction with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And I know that folks there are really excited about looking at some of the ocean worlds and, you know, some of that. So is there a connection there between the work going on on Earth and sort of applying that to how it can be done on a different, planetary body?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a big connection because there's been a lot of interest by NASA in the techniques that we use to sample and work on hydrothermal vents for the very reason that you're stating, in that the remote operations are obviously going to be necessary if we're going to look at Enceladus or any of those icy worlds out there. And right now, there's a joint effort between NASA and Woods Hole in order to try to get some experiments onto some of the space vehicles that will be going to those planets. And there is an expedition, I think, I don't remember when it's going, but there's already one that is being planned to Enceladus that Woods Hole is working with NASA on. So yes, there's a strong connection both in the methodologies and in the types of things you'd look for if you're going to look for life.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Great.
Susan, I've got a question, but it's kind of a bit out of left field. I'm just wondering if these vents have much impact on currents in the oceans, because, those currents are linked to the atmosphere and we're concerned about global warming and so on. Do you think there's any significant linkage there, or are they not large enough to be that important?
I think the answer is that they're not large enough to be that important. I mean, if you look at the size of these chimneys, even the big ones at TAG, and think of the volume of water in the ocean, they're relatively local. There is certainly, turbulence and eddies are locally associated with them. But in terms of the overall deep circulation of the ocean, they're very much point sources that probably don't have an impact.
Any more questions for Susan? I've got one more. So Susan, I was wondering, I know you're not a biologist, I was wondering about some of these marine organisms, because they're obviously down quite deep in the ocean under very high pressure conditions. So when the biologists sample them, do they have trouble bringing them to the surface? Is there any special technique that they use for that?
There isn't a special technique at the moment, but the thing is that some of the organisms don't make it back up. The anemones that I showed you at TAG end up just coming back as sort of a drizzling goo on a rock. I mean, just a mess. Mm-hmm. The shrimp you can get back alive. Most of these animals don't have to deal with the pressure because they don't have any air spaces in their bodies. They're completely filled with water, so they're incompressible. The bacteria are being cultured in the lab, and the shrimp can be kept alive in the lab. But, there is talk of trying to organize some sort of pressure sampler that would keep them at pressure until you bring them back. But, ultimately, you would have to keep them and transfer them at that pressure. So it is a problem, certainly.
Interesting. I always wondered about that. Any last questions for Susan? No, thank you so much for attending the talk. As I mentioned, if anybody does want to stay for a few minutes and just have a bit of a chat about where you are in Australia, that's great. I'll stay for a few more minutes. Otherwise, please watch out for our next online talk. There will probably be one in October or November. However, the one that is definitely on the cards is linking more to NASA. That, as I said, is going to be Dr. Lindy Elkins-Tanton talking about the Psyche mission, which by then would have launched and hopefully been successful. So that should be a really, really interesting talk. We'll try and do these talks every couple of months, and we will also try and organize some more in-person events. If you are in a city and you feel like helping to organize an in-person MIT meetup, drop me an email. We're always looking for help because I can't travel to all the cities all the time to do the events. So if there's people that want to help volunteer to organize some in-person meetups, we would definitely welcome that help. Thank you very much, Susan. We really appreciate your time.
Yep, thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Quite fascinating.
So I'm trying to see who else is on the call that we didn't meet beforehand. So we've got John. I know John is based in Melbourne. Good to see you again, John. And then Ian, I don't know if you can hear us. Where are you based, Ian? Might not be hearing us. Oh, there you are.
Yeah. So the headset on, so I only just had the speaker, so I didn't have
no worries.
voice capability, so I had to do
Sorry
a
to put you on the
hurried
spot.
change.
No problem. Where are you
Yeah,
calling from, Ian?
I'm calling from Sydney. I did a
Great.
PhD in economics at MIT many moons ago, but my original degree was in maths and physics. So I've sort of maintained an interest, in matters scientific. And one of the joys of retirement is being able to explore these things. And I must say, I thought that was a superb lecture. That really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. Thank you.
Yeah, Susan's great. She's done a lot of talks over the years on this matter, so I thought she'd be a great speaker.
Yeah.
And Tom, good to see you again. Hi. Great. Well, thanks everyone for attending, and hopefully I'll get to meet some of you in person with some of the events that we'll be organizing. Otherwise, I hope to see you on some of our next talks. We will always record them in case people can't attend, but it's always good to have some audience participation. So please try and attend them if you can, especially if you're retired and you've got the time. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Evelyn, where are you based?
I'm based in Brisbane.
Oh, Brisbane.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, based in Brisbane, and there aren't too many alums in Brisbane, so I have organized an event, but there's only a handful of us. I went down to Melbourne, and I will try and get to Sydney and some of the other cities when I can. But I think, as I said, if there's alums living there and you want to organize a get together and you just want a little bit of my support, we should do it. It's really great to have these meetups. We had one in Melbourne a few weeks ago, and it was really good. I think we had about 10-15 people there, John. Great.
And was Susan, she's still based at Woods Hole?
She is. She's an emeritus scientist now, so she's partially retired, but she still writes papers. I think she's still planning to go to sea next year, so she's still very involved. But yes, she is. She's in her 70s now, and she is retired officially.
Really impressive.
Yeah, she was an amazing PhD supervisor. I was very lucky to have her. I was the only student she had at the time because she sort of downplayed her role, but for years, she was the scientist who was overseeing the refurbishment of Alvin, which is quite a monumental task. So she only took me as a student during the years that she was involved in that. So I feel very fortunate to have had the chance to work with her. Great. Thanks very much for attending.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a great talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Very welcome. We'll try and have some more good quality ones in the coming months, and keep your eyes out for the invitations. Thanks, everyone.
Will do.
Okay,
Thank you.
fantastic. Thank you.
Bye.